So our final keynote speaker is the Honorable James P. Rubin, the Special Envoy and Coordinator of the Global Engagement Center for the United States Department of State. Mr. Rubin has more than 35 years of experience in foreign policy. Prior to this appointment, Mr. Rubin served as a diplomat, political advisor, commentator, professor, and broadcaster. Before joining the State Department, Mr. Rubin served as a diplomatic counselor to the Secretary General for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, in Paris, advising Secretary Matthias Cormann on global affairs. Prior to that, he served as chairman for international policy and strategy at Ballot Partners, based in Washington, D.C. He's also a contributing editor at Politico and a visiting professor at Oxford University's Rothermore American Institute. During the Clinton administration, Mr. Rubin served as Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs and Chief Spokesman for Madeleine K. Albright. In 1999, he was a special negotiator, secured the demobilization of the Kosovo Liberation Army. Mr. Rubin has also served as senior advisor and spokesman for the U.S. representative to the United Nations and research director for the Nonpartisan Armed Control Association from 1985 to 89. And he served as commissioner of the Port Authority and counselor for Governor Andrew Cuomo. He's been an anchor and commentator for Sky News, a visiting professor of international relations at the London School of Economics, a partner and a financial advisor from the Brunswick Group, and a co-anchor of the PBS series Wide Angle. He earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science and a Master of Arts degree in international relations from Columbia University. Let's give Honorable Rubin a round of applause.
Thank you for that. You always feel old when you hear all that stuff.
Seasoned
Seasoned veteran.
Yes.
Well, first of all, let me thank you, the U.S. Army Cyber Command, the Combined Arms Center, and the Association of the United States Army for inviting me to speak today. I think it's important you've brought together practitioners and experts from across government and industry on a necessary conversation, because this threat that we're talking about, the information threat that I will describe in a minute, is not something that can be solved by even a whole of government response. It needs a whole of society response. As you heard, I've had a long history in the narrow area where government and journalism meet, the information space, for a long, long time. The first time I heard about disinformation was during the Kosovo War, when we faced an adversary who was regularly making stories up, and we had to deal with them on a real-time basis during NATO's, I should point out, successful mission in Kosovo. I learned how dangerous it can be for disinformation to spread and not to be dealt with properly. And that's why I think Secretary Blinken, who is probably one of the most aware of the information space senior diplomats that I've ever seen. He's someone who spends time thinking about, worrying about, caring about how America is perceived around the world and what damage is done to us by our adversaries. That's why he asked me to take on the job of the GEC, which is focused on stopping foreign information manipulation, addressing it, dealing with it. And by that, I mean the activities of Russia, China, Iran, and terrorist organizations and other non-state actors. I think all of you know perfectly well that we face a global information environment that is antagonistic to American foreign policy, and our opponents, our adversaries, are trying to make it more permissive for their own. That's why it's so important that we work together. And I think why it's important that we have conferences like these, which try to bring together different domains, cyber and information. And so let me try to make three basic points today and then take some of your questions. The first is the nature of the threat we face, how serious it is. The second, what the GEC that I run is doing about it. And the third is how the Department of Defense and the State Department can work better to deal with it. If you only remember one thing today from what I said, I think it would be this, that our adversaries have been doing this for a long, long time. Russia has been doing disinformation back through the czars, through communist Russia period for hundreds of years. The Chinese Communist Party is based on propaganda and information. That's what a communist party does. So they've been doing this information warfare for a long, long time. And they fund their operations with a level of seriousness far beyond the way we fund our information operations. The numbers are very difficult to get a grip on. One of these days, I'm going to get a number out of the intelligence community that I can use, but suffice it to say that they are operating at an order of magnitude higher, 10 times than what we are spending on average each year in this area. So they have advantages in time, they have advantages in spending, they have advantages in priority. And it's only recently that I think we have come to grips with this threat in the recent couple of years. I think, unfortunately, in the early years of the internet era, there was a sense that the internet was going to provide a source of truth to the world, that it was going to spread information, true information. And so we thought by spreading these social media tools, spreading these information technologies, we were going to be spreading factual information. And I think in the recent years, we've realized the dark side of this information revolution, the dark side of globalization, and are at long last bringing attention to the problem. That's why Secretary Blinken hired me. That's why conferences like this are taking place. I've seen it throughout the establishment. People are beginning to focus on this problem in a serious way. And one thing I know is that they will not be able to outthink us. And so once we get ourselves organized properly, once we devote the resources and attention to this problem, I am not concerned. But unfortunately, we are not there yet. And so I remember watching generals testify before Congress during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and they had to figure out a way to describe whether we were winning or losing. And let me just put it this way, we're not winning. And it's a simple fact that in the information domain, our adversaries are devoting more attention and we are not winning. So when you look at this famous paradigm of DIME, diplomacy, information, military, economic, I think we all understand that in the military, there's no military finer than the United States military. It's global, it's effective, and I have no doubt that it will do its job if called upon. I think America's economy has shown itself to be the strongest economy in the world. And I know that with Secretary Blinken's work and the increased effort we've made to win friends and influence around the world, that our diplomacy is doing its job. But I have to admit that in that last domain, we're struggling. And we need to do more. We need to spend more. We need to care more. And we need to do it at a higher level. So whether it's the People's Republic of China seeking to influence or control foreign information environments to give it an edge in economic, political, and security issues, whether it's Russia spreading lies about the war in Ukraine, whether it's Iran spreading anti-US rhetoric, or foreign terrorist organizations pushing propaganda and disinformation to recruit and mobilize individuals to violence, this foreign information manipulation is a staggering challenge for the United States and our allies. And we have to realize it's a challenge not only at the level of great power competition, it's also a challenge at the tactical level. The environments to which our service members deploy are prime targets for adversaries to exploit local populations with information manipulation, and that will directly affect the safety of our and security of our forces overseas. Most information is transmitted digitally. So there's no way to contend with this threat without understanding the linkage between the info and the cyber domain. And that's why the very topic of your session today is so important. Competitors use cyber capabilities to enhance their disinformation and propaganda campaigns. And oftentimes these operations are done in a coordination with kinetic activities. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but we should never lose sight of the massive enabling function the information domain plays in all that we do. As a global power, we face global challenges around the world, and we face global information challenges around the world. I mean, this is an unclassified environment, but for those of you who do see classified information, every day I see a new report about the ways in which our adversaries are trying to exploit the modern technology, whether it's artificial intelligence. I just heard a pretty chilling account this morning, or whether it's the basic old-fashioned media. The Russians and the Chinese do this. They do it to us every day in every way they can. So what do we do about it? How should we respond? I know that's been a topic of your discussion during the course of the day. So let me tell you what we do at the Global Engagement Center. We've tried to define our activities down to two basic lines of effort. And remember, what we're dealing with here is a fundamental asymmetry, because our information is open. The world's information is largely open. Russia and China are closed. There's the Great Firewall of China, and increasingly Russia has closed its information space. And the simplest way to remember this and to think about it for me is for those of you who remember when Tiananmen Square took place, when there was a protest in the middle of the Chinese heartland in Beijing, where thousands of people were slaughtered. We watched it live on television. The whole world watched it live on television. When Yeltsin stood on the tank and stood down the opponents of change in Russia, we watched it live on television. That era is gone. When Prigozhin conducted his coup d'etat, all we saw were reporters reading from telegram channels what they thought was happening. We did not watch it in real time. We did not see it in real time. And that's just a simple way of explaining how different the media environments are for us and why we're at a fundamental asymmetry. But the good news is we're starting to put together our capabilities in a way that I think will make a difference using our advantages. The first line of effort we call expose and disrupt. And this is where we are using our interagency capability. And by that, I mean our intelligence community, which is able to downgrade information increasingly. And that's been a hallmark of this information, to downgrade information and make it available to the public so they know what's going on in a situation, in many different situations. But in the information operations, when you expose one before it happens, you are disrupting it. So if you compare a downgraded piece of information about the war in Ukraine, where today we would find out that X number of tanks and Y number of Russian soldiers died in Ukraine, that's not going to change the world. It's going to add to our knowledge of what Russia is suffering every day. But if you do what we've done at the GEC on 3 occasions, and that is expose an information operation before it happens, you can actually disrupt it. So first, in the case of Latin America, we were able to expose a plan by the Russian intelligence services to spread disinformation about the Ukraine war across several countries in Latin America before it happened or as it was happening. Similarly, we recently exposed an effort with the British and Canadian governments of Russia's effort to overthrow the government of Moldova, either through disinformation in the run-up to the election or by creating the conditions for a coup d'etat after the election. We were able to inform in advance the people of Moldova what was about to happen. And the one I'm most proud of, we did in Africa. We were able to expose what was called the African Initiative, which was an effort by Russia to discredit Western medicine by lying about the effect of Western medical facilities in Africa, saying that they were part of biological weapons testing or were causing disease rather than curing disease. And remember, this would have been a case where disinformation would have killed people, because people, potentially thousands, if not more people, would have believed that American or Western medicine, the Gates Foundation, the PEPFAR program, all the health operations we do in Africa were dangerous biological weapons testing. And some of them might not have gone to get that medical care that would save their lives. And that's the lengths Russia will go to simply to discredit the United States. They don't care about what happens to the people of Africa. We know the PEPFAR program has saved millions of lives. We know that Western medicine has made a big dent in disease in Africa. And the Russians were prepared to use the people of Africa as fodder in a campaign simply to lower perceptions of the United States without regard to the damage it was done. So that's what you can do when you work with our American intelligence community, which some people have jokingly told me is the Fort Knox of information. The trick is to get that information and use it. And it's difficult. It requires trust between individuals who are using it. It requires cooperation from those who obtain the information. I'm particularly pleased that I've been able to develop a very terrific relationship with the NSA and Cybercom, with General Nakasone for the time he was there, and with General Huff now. And you know, without getting into any detail, it's that cooperation interagency that allows us from time to time, when the conditions are right and when the intelligence community believes it can bear the cost of exposure, that exposure can actually disrupt an information operation before it happens. Think of it as like an inoculation. And what's important about it is the idea of sourcing. So when we expose the architecture of, or the purveyors of an information operation to an audience, we are giving them the source of information. We're telling them the Russians are about to tell you something that's not true. And think about the difference just on the most obvious level. I ran into this in Bulgaria, where their Russian-speaking community is very large. And if they are seeing something on television or in the radio or on a website or in a newspaper, and many of them still use what we call old media. And it says the United States has biological weapons in Ukraine, which was a particular thing the Russians repeated over and over again. Well, compare how they would react if they had to read the Russians say the United States has biological weapons in Ukraine. Those are two very different thoughts. I would say the long-term objective in this business is to attach a source to information, because that's the way we will be able to prevent Russia and China from manipulating through anonymity, from using the freedom of anonymity the internet provides against us, by ensuring that to the maximum extent possible, we are providing the source and provenance of information. That's the purpose of exposure, so that they know who's about to tell them something, and ideally understand that they're about to be manipulated. And that, I've found, is one area in this place where journalists and government officials, I think all of you in this room understand, there's what they call an invitation to struggle between journalism and government. And that's something I've lived on both sides. But on this issue, disinformation, it's much less of a divide, because journalists know the world they want to live in, where their jobs matter, where it's a fact-based world, is at risk just as much as we believe it's at risk from Russian and Chinese disinformation and information manipulation. And there's much less of a struggle with journalists, and they are actually part of the solution. If we don't have journalists telling people about what Russia and China are doing, and instead you have cases where journalists are paid off by the Russians or the Chinese, or you have RT, which is putting out propaganda and disinformation every day, you're not going to be able to do that. So that's expose and disrupt. That's the most important thing I think we can do, is inoculate people against disinformation before it happens. Because once it's happened, it's very difficult to put it back in the box. It's very difficult to combat the damage. We can try through messaging, and we have to try, but it's much better to get it in advance. The second thing we're doing is what I call organize and galvanize, and that is to do what the United States does best as a leader in the world. You know, we're called the indispensable nation, not because we can do everything, but because we're the one country that can galvanize others to do things together. That's what we've done in Ukraine. That's what we've done in many cases in the past in building coalitions, whether it was against ISIS or other problems in the world, money laundering, climate change. We need to build a coalition of countries who want to live in a fact-based world, who don't want their sovereignty, their information sovereignty, to be violated by Russian or Chinese information operations. So we've done that with 19 countries now. We've built a coalition based on a framework to fight disinformation, which is essentially a list of activities that you need to take this matter seriously. You need a government policy. You need an organization that works on it. You need to have the capability to look at the information space. I'd like to us reach the day when we can look out at the information space in the same way that those of you who are looking at airspace or sea space or naval space and land warfare, be able to see what is happening in a real time and share it with our allies and know when an information operation is about to happen, have what they call a common operational picture. That's the goal. We have 19 countries. Most of the major countries in the world have already signed on: Japan, South Korea, most European countries. You know, the French are still twiddling around with some of the wordings, but we have all of the key NATO countries, and we had our first African country sign on as well. We're going to continue to do that, and we want to build the biggest possible coalition of countries who want to have this basic fact-based world. So that's how you organize the world, essentially to defend itself against this information warfare that we're facing every day around the world. The last thing I'd like to talk about is collaboration with the Army and the Defense Department. Before he retired, as I mentioned to you, I developed a very good relationship with General Nakastone. He understood the threat we faced. He advocated for linking the cyber and information lines of effort, making sure they were synchronized. And he knew we were strongest when the State Department and the Defense Department worked together. I've also met with General Huff, and I'm going to meet with him again shortly to continue this partnership, because he had, as you do in the military, a long period where he was working side by side with General Nakasone before he took over, so that when he stepped into the role, he was ready for it. We don't do as much of that in the State Department, and I must tell you, it makes a huge difference. So we need to work across government to make sure we're in contact, because we can't do this work if we do this alone in stovepiped functions without a whole of government approach. So how do we ensure the DoD and GEC work better, the State Department and the DoD work better? I believe there's three elements to that: building relationships, leveraging placement and access, and joining forces to help build resiliency with partner countries. So first, building relationships. As the Army transitions to the Theater Information Advantage detachments, it's imperative that command teams and personnel build relationships and have interaction with the GEC and the PD sections of the embassies that Paul Kurchowski talked about in their area of responsibility. The same is true for other services here today: the Marine Corps, Marine Information Groups, and the Air Force Cyber and Information Forces should also be closely tied to the Department of State, so they can identify and counter foreign disinformation overseas. In the GEC, we have military advisors on each of our threat teams, the Russia team, the China team, that can help enable those lines of communication. I have a colonel who joined me today, Rob Thielen. Where are you, Rob? Somewhere there he is, sir. He works in our front office, and he can help ensure that the State Department and the Defense Department are better synchronized. So the second way is to leverage placement and access. The Department of Defense is uniquely positioned through security cooperation agreements, deployments, and foreign exercises with placement and access to critical information environments around the globe. We too at the State Department have placement and access across the globe through embassies and some combatant commands. But how do we leverage this combined power? Through deliberate measures such as joint training, tighter coordination, we can ensure that our messaging is mutually reinforcing. So when foreign actors seek to disinform, we can at least message correctly and protect our reputation and ideally protect our forces in extremis. And lastly, I think we need to work to see that the Department of Defense and the State Department help build resilience with partner and allied countries. So as I mentioned, we have this framework to fight disinformation. I think there is a role for the Department of Defense to complementary in developing government and societal resilience to disinformation, especially when it comes to supporting the human and technical capacity to understand the cyber dimensions of the information space. So what am I talking about here? Well, you do training, you do exercises, you educate them on all the other domains when you work with foreign governments under various security structures. There's no reason why the information domain should be different. And if we can work together, I have to confess, we sometimes would benefit from your resources. The State Department operates in millions. You operate in billions by and large. This is not expensive work. That's what's interesting about it. Basically, a group of people, 12, 14 people with computers can begin to look at their own information space. That's hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions at most. That's not, the cost of an F-35. And if we can find a way so that all these countries that we sign up to this framework can begin to benefit from security cooperation and have the ability to look at their information space, eventually we can build that common operational picture I was describing. So the threat is daunting, but I do believe the great aircraft carrier of American foreign policy is moving slowly towards fixing this problem. It's something that is obviously ironic that it's American technology that has enabled the problem, that has made it possible for our adversaries to do so much damage through social media and the internet. But we're going to have to use our technology, our smarts, and our commitment and our recognition at the highest levels of government that this is a problem. And I would just repeat that our adversaries do this at the highest levels of government as a matter of course. It is normal business for the Communist Party of China to do information manipulation. That's what they do, communist parties. It is done at this level by the Russians. Their ministers get together and talk about how at the ministerial level, what are they going to do in the information space? We do not do that yet. We have the GEC and we're working on it. And I'm making contacts here and with military officials. I work closely with the White House, but we're still not doing this as a country using all of our skill sets, all of our smarts, and the resources necessary to deal with it. But I think we can get there. And as your conference, if it has a second round next year, I'd like to think the aircraft carrier will be a little bit farther along, and that eventually we will be in a position to say that we're not, we can get away from the phrase not winning and maybe someday get back to the phrase of winning the information war. We're not there yet. Thank you. Absolutely.
Good afternoon. Ken Kreitzer, Cambets Media, White Plains, New York. Sir, great to hear your comments today. We were all, some of us out in May at the AUSA conference on Indo-Pacific, and there were 30 different countries represented at the meeting, and Charles Flynn talked about working with partners, allies, and friends. You've had a couple of countries join NATO, up to 30 now. What is the key to leveraging the relationships the military has and the State Department has to share information, gain information, and protect against cyber?
Well, like in a lot of things, it starts with recognition of that it's a problem. I think Albania was attacked by the Iranians, and believe me, the first call they made was to the United States to get help to deal with the cyber attack that did terrible damage. We've heard about many stories about cyber attacks around the world. What I tend to work on is that place where cyber and information meet, and where cyber attacks can enable information operations through hack and leaks, through disabling websites, through other methods that can be used directly by the adversaries. I think to get people to work together requires a diplomatic skill, obviously. It requires a recognition of the threat. I would like to think that every country wants to believe that its information domain is sovereign, that another country shouldn't be able to secretly, covertly enter their space and mislead their countrymen. And I think if you put it that way to most countries in the world, they will agree with that. Our problem comes when we have some countries that are willing to talk about Russia, but not willing to talk about China, or some countries that are willing to talk about China that are not willing to talk about Russia, although there are less of those. I'd be hard pressed actually to find one. But the point I'm making is that some countries don't want to join if the operation is perceived as joining the United States in some alliance against the Communist Party of China, for example. So I think we have to make it generic, and we have to talk about it in a generic way, where we're not saying that China or Russia doesn't go about broadcasting and saying and doing what they want, but they can't do it secretly and covertly. And that's why I get to this point about sourcing and provenance. And once you can reach a point where every country knows that the information that's coming into their system, that's readable, viewable, listenable, is labeled in some way, that it comes from Russia, that it comes from this Communist Party of China, I think we will be able to deal with this problem in a much better way. Right now, the freedom of anonymity that comes with the internet is being used against us. And so what I'm trying to do is figure out how to prevent that. And as we make countries aware of this problem and make them understand how much damage is being done, every day I read a cable from some country where views of the United States or the war in Ukraine have changed because Russia or China has been dominating their information space. And essentially in the information space, Russia and China both report flat out lies about the war in Ukraine, that somehow the United States wants this war, that the United States is making money from the war, that NATO expansion caused the war, that the US biological weapons caused the war, all sorts of things like that. Russia and China both are broadcasting or messaging that all over the world. And in countries that you might think of have a rational population, it becomes believable if they are not resilient. And that's why we have to work with other countries to spend the money on the media literacy, to spend the money on helping journalists. Let me give you another example of things we can do. The Chinese are particularly effective at what I would call information dominance. Xinhua, their wire service, unlike say RT, is not filled with lies. It's generally got true information, but biased. So it will report every single bad thing that happened in the United States on a given day that are true. There was a murder in Los Angeles. There was something, a hurricane in South Florida. And then only wonderful things happen in China. And then they will dominate a country by giving that Xinhua service at a reduced rate. And in certain cases, even saying you can't use any other service. So what we need to do is work with the Japanese and the South Koreans and others to start making it available at reduced rates for countries that don't have the money, actual real news like the BBC for the British, or Kyoto News for the Japanese, and the Associated Press for the United States. And then they will no longer be dominated by a skewed view of the world in which only terrible things happen in the United States and wonderful things happen in China. Yes.
Hello, sir. Thanks very much for talking to us this afternoon. I'm Sidney Friedberg. I'm a reporter. It's always good to know that we're not inevitably in existential conflict.
I think we're not in this case.
Yeah. One question. I mean, historically, the story of U.S. sort of information influence ops is not encouraging. There's been lots of we try to do X on Twitter and it fizzled or was traced back. What's our asymmetric advantage that we should focus on here? Probably we can't pay Russian trolls to say, well, actually Putin was born in Kenya, or the President Xi stole the election because there wasn't one. But we can't mirror image what they're trying to do to us. We're not good at that, and they're not vulnerable to it. But what can we do? Just a sort of name and shame, I think, is leading that direction. But I think there's a lot more you could probably say on what our asymmetric advantages in this space that we would be underutilizing.
Thank you for that. As you probably noticed, I focused on, broadly speaking, defense. Active defense would be exposing their operations. That would be an active defense. A more passive defense would be the framework to build resilience, where countries are better able to defend themselves against this. I did not spend much time on messaging, and that wasn't an accident. Messaging is what you're talking about. How do we get out the truth about Russia and China more effectively, and rebut the lies told about the United States more effectively? And I have to admit, it's a big challenge. The United States comes with a lot of baggage around the world in certain countries. We have a history. We are the biggest and baddest actor on the scene. By bad, I mean strong. And so there's a tendency in Asia, African, and Latin American countries to remember those things we did that were bullying or were perceived as using our strength to our advantage. Russia and China play on that. But I think if you look at the way China's image has changed in the recent years, we're starting to do a much better job. 4 years ago, European countries were making a investment treaty with China. They were all committed to a formal investment treaty with China. And now, as a result of our education about China's activities supporting Russia's war in Ukraine, which for Europeans is an existential war, something they care about, the Europeans are starting to change their view of China. I think that's the most important single change in the attitudes of the world in the last several years. And that's a very conscious result of us carefully and convincingly and without exaggeration showing Europeans what damage China is doing, not only by repeating Russian lies about the cause of the war, but by supporting them economically and now supporting their defense industrial base in a way that has made it possible for Russia to pursue what is effectively, the largest land war in modern times. I mean, we sort of forget about what's going on. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of troops going at each other every day in the heart of Europe. And for Europeans, this is a fundamental issue. And we've been able, through messaging, by explaining what Russia's how important China's help has been to Russia, to change minds in Europe about China. When we came into office, I think it would be fair to say there was far greater openness to the Chinese markets, to the idea that they needed to do business with China. And I think we've been able to persuade European governments to de-risk by changing their habits about what they will sell and buy and how they will sell and buy it, about developing supply chains so that China can't dominate and impose economic coercion on countries the way it had done in the past. And similarly, we provide information about simple things. The GEC, one of our projects, which is very effective, we have a monitor of the one of the dams. I think it's the Three Gorge Dam in China, where they try to misrepresent to the southern, the countries below in Thailand and Vietnam, about how much water comes out each day and what damages it's done. We put an actual meter there and spread the word to the people in Southeast Asia. Here's how much water is actually in the dam, so that when they claim that the cause of the lack of water for irrigation is X, we can say, no, actually it's Y. So we have to use tools like that. Unfortunately, we often have to use what we call third parties. In some parts of the world, it's better to have a think tank identify an activity of Russia or an activity of China, because they're more believable, or they won't be seen as biased, or they won't be seen as saying it for competitive purposes. So that's a big job. It's not something I can do at the GEC, but it's something this administration has tried to do. I think the most effective tool we've had is this really hallmark of the administration, and something I give General Nakasone a lot of credit for. When I was growing up, the word NSA was something you couldn't say. And nowadays, we've found opportunities to use information obtained through intelligence sources and made it available to educate the world on what Russia was going to do before the Ukraine war, the fact of their invasion. I think that made a big difference. Let's remember, we all have to be honest. Prior to that, the last time the United States had made an intelligence judgment that was well known around the world was about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which was an incorrect judgment. And now, after Ukraine and after a series of things that we've done since then, when we put information out, it's widely accepted rather than doubted. And that's something, as I think all of us know, one mistake, it takes a long time to build back from it, but I think we've done so. And I think nowadays, when we explain that Russia is getting 90% of its microelectronics from the Chinese, people believe us. It happens to be true, but people believe us, and that's the most important thing. Thank you. Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. Colonel Tamisha Norris. I'm the director of the Joint Information School in Norfolk, Virginia. There are students, we emphasize the importance of working with the GEC, making sure that they are getting those assessments and those reports as they return to their units and working the combatant commands or joint task forces. So my concern is, sir, is I've been hearing some rumors about dissolving your organization and it potentially going away. I would like to know what your thoughts are moving forward and what you vision for your organization. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I mean, the GEC is an unusual entity. It was created by senators. Two senators created it, Senator Portman and Senator Murphy. And there had been a group working on countering terrorist propaganda, and had become quite successful at it. And these two senators said, now we're in a great power competition, and Russia and China need to are conducting this information warfare, and we need an organization that can work on it. And so they created the GEC's mandate 7 years ago, and gradually we've gotten better and better and better at our work, as you would expect. When we first got there, it was a little tricky. The State Department didn't quite know what to do with this thing called the GEC, and we had to, accommodate ourselves to a State Department culture, which tends, for example, to the last question, not to want to always say what the Russians and Chinese are doing bad, but only want to emphasize what the United States is doing good. So a GEC that's telling the hard truths about Russia or the hard truths about China wasn't an immediate good fit in the State Department. But over 7 years, that has improved. The other thing that's happened is, I think all of you understand in your business relationships. And we've built relationships of trust between people who work in the public diplomacy area with those who work in the most secret programs the United States has, so that we can expose these operations as I've described. And they trust each other. They know that if they're provided certain information, they'll only say that much and not more. And then the other side in the argument is more willing to provide it the next time and has greater faith in it. And then you build that trust, and it's built up over 7 years. But naturally, just as it's finally starting to kick into gear, it's going to sunset at the end of this year. And by that, I mean that its authorization will end. in December. And unless Congress passes a new authorization, the GEC as it currently exists will end. Now, why wouldn't someone want to continue the GEC? For the life of me, I cannot figure out why Congress wouldn't want people to do what I do every day, which is wake up in the morning and figure out how to fight Russian, Chinese, and Iranian disinformation and propaganda. I think all Americans want that to happen. Unfortunately, a small number seem to think we do something else, which we don't do, which is operate in the United States. And we've fallen into a guilt by association situation where people think we're doing something we're not doing in the United States. And I can't explain it other than to say I believe that anybody who sees the work that we actually do, who hears the speech that I just gave, would understand and read the reports that we put out and see the exposure that we do, would see that we are solely focused on what goes on outside of the United States. That's what we do. We fight the information war, the undeclared information war in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and in Europe, period. But some seem to think otherwise, and they have put a block on its reauthorization. And I frankly don't know what's going to happen. I do know that Secretary Blinken and the White House believe strongly in this operation, believe strongly in this mission. And I know that the Senate, Republicans and Democrats alike, all believed strongly in this mission. But there are a few members in the House who don't. And it's unfortunate. I think it would be damaging to our national security to not have an entity figuring out every day how to fight back against Russian and Chinese information warfare. And as of now, we are you know, I'm worried.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Let's give a round of applause.